Hello heliocentrists. It occurred to me that this video would be better accompanied by some kind of narrative description, some sort of narration, so here it goes. This lecture is on academies, dictionaries, and doctrines, prescriptivism in the long 18th century. The long 18th century refers roughly to the period between the Restoration in 1688 and, it varies, but generally the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars around 1812, 1815, which represents the period that includes the Enlightenment and really the rise of the British Empire. And this guy here, which we'll talk about in a bit, is a very important figure in the history of the English language and in literary criticism as well. His name is Dr. Samuel Johnson. The doctor was an honorific. We'll talk more about him. So first of all, one of the things that's sort of founding our period here is the rise of the nation state and the idea that a nation has a single correct universal standard language. And this was enacted in France through the establishment under the absolutist royal monarchy of France of the Academie Francaise. This is a picture of it here along the banks of the Seine. It's this grand palace. It was established in 1635 by Cardinal Richelieu, chief minister to Louis XIII. You may know of Cardinal Richelieu if you ever read The Three Musketeers. It's obvious elitism sort of rubbed the wrong way in the French Revolution, and it was suppressed in 1793, which was a period of rapid transformation for the French language. This is when the street argot of Parisian became much closer to what is now standard French, and what the French monarch spoke before that is more like the drawl of Quebec. Anyway, the Academy was restored in 1803 under Napoleon. And it has 40 members always, and you serve from appointment to death, and even though they die, they are still known informally as les immortels, the immortals, the undying ones. And they act as an official authority on the language. They publish an official dictionary of the language, and their rulings are advisory and not binding. They are not law, but they tend to be followed by newspapers, academic journals, government, etc. So they have a great deal of authority, if not legal force. There's one of the controversies is over the female form of professeur, professeuse, which according to the Académie Francaise is not French. If a woman is a professor, you call her le professeur because that is a male word. It's not something that admits of gender, even though French nouns are gendered. And this has been controversial, and the usage of it has gone up and down. You could sort of track the fortunes of feminism in France with the use of this word. And it's kind of weird how in France they're arguing for the use of a gendered word, whereas in English similar debates have sought the elimination of gendered words like for professions like actress and waitress and so on. So this isn't to say that we're right and they're wrong, or they're wrong and we're right, but that the contest of what language means in terms of politics and inclusivity and all of these change from context to context. I also wanted to show you this cool tool, books.google.com/ngrams, which allows you to track the usage of a word over time. This may be useful to you in, for example, your final research paper. So there were some people in England who thought, hey, this sounds like a great idea. We should have an English Academy too. These included James Howell, John Dryden, who was the first official poet laureate of England in the court of Charles II. The famous author Daniel Defoe wrote that no author, this is him arguing for an academy, an English Academy of the language, no author would have the impudence to coin without their authority. Custom, which is now our best authority of words, would always have its original here and not be allowed without it. There should be no more occasion to search for derivations and construction, and it would be as criminal then to coin words as money. I like this idea that making up a new word is like counterfeiting money, right? You don't want to inflate the language with a bunch of like crappy words. These are pretty harsh words too. To call coining words criminal, especially since this is the time when England is increasingly coming under what's been called the Bloody Code, where like hundreds and hundreds of minor crimes are hanging offenses, basically. And if you don't want to hang, later on you can get shipped to Australia, the other side of the world. Anyway, Jonathan Swift wrote a book called A Proposal for the Reform of the English Language, which widely circulated, and this is proposed in Academy as well. Swift was favored by Queen Anne, but she died, and then we got a guy named George I, the first Hanoverian king. And he was brought over because, by an accident of genealogy, he happened to be the next Protestant in line for the throne. And he didn't even know English, and he spoke German, and he didn't have much interest in what the English did with their language. But the next major figure is Samuel Johnson. And Johnson was a fascinating guy. And he was a poet, an essayist, a moralist. He's a kind of a moral philosopher, very influenced by Romans in this way. A literary critic, wrote wonderful essays and biographies about the literary tradition up to his time, and a brilliant prose stylist too, wonderful writer, a biographer, an editor, and, important for our purposes, a lexicographer, a maker of dictionaries. He was also a college dropout. He had gone to Oxford, but didn't have the money to continue. It's also believed, anybody who's interested in disability studies might find this interesting, that he had Tourette syndrome as well. And he wrote against the idea of the Academy. There he is, by the way, sitting in an 18th century salon, sort of holding court while people in wigs chat. Quick note, 17th century, hold on, wait for it. 17th century, big wigs. 18th century, little wigs. Anyway, he wrote, academies have been instituted to guard the avenues of their languages, to retain fugitives, and repulse intruders. But their vigilance and activity have hitherto been vain. Sounds are too volatile and subtile for legal restraints. To enchain syllables and to lash the wind are equally the undertakings of pride, unwilling to measure its desires by its strength. In other words, you can make an academy to try to control and regulate the language all you want, but people are going to talk how they talk. You may as well try to tie up the wind as to tie up the language. And this is what he wrote in the preface to his dictionary. But his dictionaries, people have written, became a sort of academy itself. It was first published in 1755. He wrote it on commission for about $300,000 US in 2017 money. It took 9 years to write about, and he had a few assistants, but largely it was done by himself. And it was the preeminent dictionary of English until the completion of the OED in 1928. So it, as becoming the standard dictionary of reference, exercised an enormous influence on the language and a stabilizing influence on the language, because if everyone's using the same dictionary for 150, 170 years, then the language is going to change. And this is the period when English change slows to a crawl. It's been changing much more quickly from the Middle Ages and through the early modern period, and now change slows down. Certain small changes will continue. New vocabulary will be added. There will be some further slight reductions in grammar, and style will change. In the 20th century, especially with the greater mass media and print and newspapers, style will become simpler. People wrote more elaborately in the 18th century, but they wrote more elaborately with the same basic grammar that we have now. Here's an example. Opulence, wealth, riches, affluence. And he always gives a quotation, often from authors that he knew and liked himself. There in full opulence a banker dwelt, who all the joys and pangs of riches felt. His sideboard glittered with imagined plate, and his proud fancy held a vast estate. Jonathan Swift. This is an example of an entry in Johnson's dictionary, and so the dictionary also serves as a kind of treasury of quotations for the language as well that people became very familiar with. It was also not entirely a dull work. I think Lear talks about this a bit. Excise, a hateful tax levied upon commodities, and adjudged not by the common judges of property, but wretches hired by those to whom excise is paid. This is another word for tariff, an excise or sales tax. So topical, lexicographer. And this is funny. A writer of dictionaries, a harmless drudge that busies himself in tracing the original and detailing the signification of words. There's a little bit of self-deprecating humor here. Oats, and here's a little bit of nationalistic humor. A grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people. Johnson was a brilliant man, but a man of his time, and generally his work is dripping with contempt for the Scots. Poor Scots. Monsieur, a term of reproach for a Frenchman. Love that one. Writative, a word of Pope's, not to be imitated. I like how he uses dictionary just to throw shade at another writer. Increase of years makes men more talkative, but less writative. To that degree, I now write letters, but of more of a plain how days. Okay, so on to another great feature of this age was that people started writing grammars of English, and this hadn't really been a thing before. Generally, grammars were written before this time in order to learn other languages. When you've heard Shakespeare went to the Stratford Grammar School, grammar meant Latin. To learn grammar was to learn Greek or to learn Latin, and the first grammars that we know of were written in India. There was a tradition of writing grammars to learn Sanskrit, and this was after Sanskrit had already turned into other early Hindic languages such as Pali. But in the West, we know that Romans wrote grammars to learn Greek. It's like, what do you need a grammar to learn your own language for? Well, when the language changes and you want to preserve it, or when you get such a sense of the importance of your own language that you feel that there's a right way and a wrong way to speak it, and that you want to sort of make available the right way to speak it in order to preserve that right way, then suddenly you want to write a grammar of your own language. And this actually happens in Rome in the 2nd and 3rd century, when the language, the Latin that people are actually speaking, which is called Vulgar Latin, is increasingly separating from the classical Latin of Virgil and Horace, which had been written 200 years. This is when you start getting Romans writing grammars of Latin, even though they're ostensibly Latin speakers. Here in England in the 18th century, we get prescriptive grammars written. And prescriptive means this is how you're supposed to do it. I'm telling you what it's supposed to be like. And we contrast prescriptive with descriptive. Now, modern linguists write descriptive grammars. For example, I had a linguistics professor in college at the University of Florida who was a field linguist, and she had done work with the Aymari people in present-day Bolivia. And she went down there and she lived with them for a long time and learned their language very carefully and wrote like the authoritative descriptive language of this indigenous language, a grammar of this indigenous language. And she wasn't interested in recording rules about how people thought was correct Guaymari or whatever it was called. She wanted to know how they actually spoke, right? And so people will write descriptive grammars of various dialects of English, from Glaswegian Scots to African American vernacular English to Jamaican Creole, without judging right or wrong, but actually what is understood and how sentences are formed. That's description. This is prescription, which is all about how, hey, this is how you're going to do it, pal. And so there have been some lasting effects of the 18th century movement to grammatical prescription on our language, some of which are still controversial. For example, don't split infinitives. Don't say to boldly go, say to go boldly. Now, this seems... The reason that they said you don't split infinitives is because in Latin, you can't. You can't split an infinitive because the infinitive... In Latin, if I say I love, it's amo. If I say to love, it's amare. One word, right? Just like in French or Spanish or Italian, the infinitive is one word. You can't split a word, right? But we can in English because we form infinitives differently. So that this is not necessarily logical, but it was under the influence of the authority and prestige of Latin. And some of these prescriptions are based on the example of Latin, and some are based on a kind of logic. For example, there is this idea that you can have comparatives of the incomparable. You can't say, like if you've ever heard somebody like criticize somebody for saying that somebody is the most unique. Well, no, unique is not something that, if something's unique, it's unique. You can't be more or less unique. Unique means one of a kind. How can you be more or less one of a kind, right? It logically doesn't admit comparison. And there's other examples, you know, round, perfect, chief. Now, obviously, the framers of our Constitution didn't get this memo when they talked about forming a more perfect union. Taller than he is one of the effects that we say, you know, she is taller than he. And the idea is that they're syntactically parallel, even though idiomatically we would say taller than him. But this is one of the rules of grammatical prescription, and this one makes some sense. Him doing that versus his doing that, we prescribe, you know, when I say, you know, I don't approve of him doing that, we should say his doing that according to the prescriptive grammar. Two negatives in English destroy one another or are equivalent to an affirmative. This is another rule coming in under the influence of logic. As we learned in Middle English and also in Early Modern English, we have negative concord where two negatives can increase each other. Another example is the sorting out of when we use shall and will. Shall is first person and will is the second and third person. And once upon a time, these were just different languages. These were just different modals, but they sort of get lumped together and sorted between the persons. And people had different views on what the basis of prescription should be. Robert Lowth was very much committed, who wrote the most widely circulated and authoritative grammar, the one that everybody learned from. All schoolboys had a copy of Lowth, and it was sort of, there are novels that talk about, you know, people studying their Lowth so that they could move up in society by speaking correctly. And he was very much of the follow Latin models school, whereas Priestley followed what's called the doctrine of usage. The general prevailing custom, whatever it happens to be, can be the only standard for the time that it prevails. This pictured here is not actually Joseph Priestley. This is just a very old meme because, according to my son, middle-aged people are where memes go to die. But anyway, that's just a little bit about prescription. I hope that this has been useful to you and unpacked this rather dense slideshow a bit. Get at me with any questions, and I hope you're enjoying your work. Take it easy.